Hey lovelies, for my final project for my history class, I'm going to talk about Irish history and how the Irish made their mark in the United States. A quick disclaimer, I will list my sources down below, and I'll try to be as accurate as possible, but keep in mind, this is a school project. So if you're looking for 100% accuracy, you're probably not going to find it here. That being said, let's get started. Irish immigration in the United States can be split into two different waves. The first being in 1714 to 1750, and the second being between 1820 and 1930. During the first wave, the Irish that were fleeing were escaping high rents, poor harvests, and high tithes from the Anglican churches. Speaking of religion, English penal laws were set up against Protestant and Roman Catholic dissenters. So under these laws, you couldn't enter a profession, you couldn't own a horse worth more than 5 pounds, you couldn't own a firearm, and you couldn't even study Irish or play Irish music. Fast forward to the second wave, the reason for immigrating was similar, but additionally, the fungus Phytophthora infestans, aka the potato blight, caused a famine in 1845. By the way, if I'm looking down a lot, it's because my notes are right here and I don't want to flub anything up. Back to the plot. With the approximately million deaths that occurred, as well as 4.5 million people that left for the United States, Ireland's population was reduced from 8.2 million to 6.6 million in about a decade. Only 4.7 million remained in 1891, and by the 1840s, Irish people comprised about half of all U.S. immigrants. It's at this point that I'd like to bring up that a lot of people, primarily a lot of anti-SJW types, like to draw comparisons between Irish American and African American experiences. While I agree there are some connections and some similarities, the Irish were never slaves in the United States quite the same way that African Americans were. When they arrived in the United States, Irish Americans often went through indentured servitude to pay for their asylum. So while the Irish were seen as second-class citizens, they were never really seen as property like African Americans were. But anyways, Irish people often settled near ports where they disembarked, or they settled in rural areas, often crowded into subdivided homes intended for only single families. As for work, Irishmen often were miners, and I'm not talking about the miners that politicians like, or they were canal or railroad builders. Women often worked as servants or domestic workers, and even children had to find arduous and menial jobs to help their parents afford their homes. In West Virginia, coal operators fired their union workers and gave jobs to the Irish, Italian, and African American workers because, as they put it, the company owned them. So while the job force had a problem with racial discrimination, it was also a matter of class discrimination, and the two kind of exacerbated each other. Keep this in mind, it's going to come up again later. However, over time, many Irish people climbed the social ladder through politically appointed positions, such as in the field of law enforcement, firefighting, and even education. By the time the second and third generation Irish people were old enough, families such as the Kennedys, yes, JFK's family, entered circles of power. And the first Kennedy arrived in 1848, and his grandson, JPK, made a fortune that enabled his son, JFK, to win himself the position of the 35th president. Despite the prosperity that many Irish people were fortunate enough to come across, there was no shortage of conflict and discrimination. Keep in mind, the second wave of Irish immigration came about during the Second Awakening, if I remember correctly. So not only was anti-Irish discrimination based on the fact that they were immigrants, it was also charged by the anti-Catholic fervor, especially from the Nativist Party, aka the Know-Nothings, who opposed all foreign influences. However, this didn't stop Catholicism from spreading across the United States, and especially the St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City was built in 1879 to support the growing Catholic population, since it couldn't fit in St. Peter's Church anymore. While the church itself was designed to hold about 2,400 congregants, The building itself can hold about 19,000 people total, all an influence of the growing Irish population. Now, to go back to the Irish American and African American struggle I was talking about, this is where them exacerbating each other kind of reached its apex. When the Conscription Act of 1863 was passed, all white men between the ages of 20 and 45 were eligible for the Union Army draft during the American Civil War. While African Americans could volunteer, so to speak, they were never forced to enlist and fight. And that's something that, unfortunately, Irish Americans were not fortunate to have. During this time, white men with money could bribe doctors for medical exemptions, they could hire substitutes, or pay a commutation of a draft, which again was not something afforded to Irish Americans. Because of this, several American cities, most notably Chicago, were suffering draft riots by the hands of poor white men, as well as Irish Americans who targeted Roman officers and African Americans. Again, however, adversity was not enough to keep the Irish people down. And over time, Irish people climbed the social ladder again and worked themselves into higher positions. Such examples were William R. Grace, who became New York City's first Irish American mayor in 1880, and then Hugh O'Brien won himself the same position in Boston 4 years later. Today, approximately 9.2% of the United States population, or about 30.3 million Americans, claim to be or are actually of Irish descent. Actually, no. 30.3 million Americans and one. For example, many of the workers that built the infrastructure and buildings that we know of today were of Irish descent, or at least some of them were. Just like the rest of the immigrant groups that came to America before and after them, the Irish left their marks in American culture that affects us even to this day. In fact, Labor Day is the fruit of workers such as Mary Harris, who co-founded the Social Democratic Party in 1868, Terence Vincent Powderly, who built himself, pun intended, to be General Master Workman, the highest post of the Union, George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO and a civil rights activist, and the Molly Maguire's group, which fought for workers' rights, the abolition of child labor, and improved working conditions, all of whom were Irish or under the influence of the Irish. In our current political climate, immigration, illegal or otherwise, is hotly contested and is a divisive topic. However, as the old saying goes, we are all immigrants or descendants of immigrants, and the history of the Irish is a clear example of that. While there are some aspects of immigration that are messy and require a lot of nuance to deal with properly, we can't ignore the impact that immigrants have had in our country and culture, and they should never be taken for granted. So if you're Irish or of Irish descent, remember your history, be proud of your roots, and help other immigrants of other cultures do the same as well. Thank you so much for watching. Toodles.